Talks, where protecting children's privacy is the name of the game today. So protecting children's privacy is becoming more relevant than ever. From a very young age, children use the internet to learn, play, and interact with others, and express themselves, of course. This has also never been more true than during the COVID-19 pandemic, when educational, social, and entertainment interactions all moved to the online world and became much more digital in nature. This online space, however, was never designed for children and therefore exposes children to serious risks, serious privacy risks, which we're going to get to discuss today. And in order to leverage the benefits that the internet brings to young people's lives while tackling the harms and challenges it represents, and in line with the several different objectives laid out by the EU, especially in the principles of earlier this year in January 2002, necessary precautions must be discussed. So that's what we're going to do today on this Tech That Talks. And after all, if we look at where global digital advertising for children is headed, the market is expected to surpass the value of 21.1 billion by the end of 2031. That's a really large number. So we can only devise and implement overarching data protection for children if we are able to anticipate the trends of where data privacy is going to go, explore the future implications of technology, and guide its development towards desirable outcomes. In the end, which brighter worlds for children do we intend to design to ensure fair, transparent, and privacy-centered use of personal data? Privacy must be obtained in a special manner, and for this, we also need to look at which tools are then used and how children's privacy is protected overall in general. So where is the current state of EU, UK, and US also legislation in terms of children's privacy? Let's focus on that today for Tech That Talks. I'd now like to take the moment to introduce our three different panelists who have come from the UK, Ireland, and from the US. Anna Morgan joins us from Bird and Bird. Duncan McGann joins us from Five Rights Foundation, and Nicholas Shepard joins us from Covington and Burling LLP. For all of our panelists who are online today, you can use the tool on your Zoom screen in order to ask any questions that you may have. And as always, we'll get to them towards the end of our panel. Thank you very much. So I'd like to start on with Duncan. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Five Rights Foundation, which is a very important NGO that's fighting for a stronger children's privacy legislation. I'll start with the question. The introduction of educational technology devices and apps into a classroom, so a development that we've seen a lot more during the COVID pandemic, has motivated to have people use remote schooling. This has also raised the eyebrows, of course, of lots of privacy professionals. So let's start with a general introduction towards the current state of children's privacy in the UK. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, and then also where directly Five Rights stands.
Yeah, great, and thanks so much for having me today. Yeah, so just a very quick introduction to Five Rights. We're quite a small organisation that maybe not everybody's heard of. So we were started a number of years ago by Baroness Biban Kidron here in the UK as a centre really to work on three distinct areas of children's digital experience. First of all, data and privacy. Secondly, looking much more at child-centred design and how design really affects children's experience. And then leveraging wider children's rights issues at the UN and other fora. And part of the work that we did, and probably what the organisation is best known for, both within the UK and internationally, is that we were the architect of the age-appropriate design code here in the UK. In fact, it was a parliamentary amendment by Baroness Kidron to the Data Protection Act, which was the act that brought the GDPR into the UK legislation, which required our information commissioner, relatively analogous to the US FTC or something like that, to create a specific code which platforms then needed to follow when building services that were likely to be accessed by children. Now, this came into force in September 2021. So it still remains a relatively new piece of policy here in the UK. But I think if we are trying to think about taking stock of where we are in the UK with both the introduction of the Data Protection Act, which brought in GDPR 4 years ago, and then the Age Appropriate Design Code about 9 months ago, I think we've made enormous progress in that time, but that's not to say that there isn't also a huge amount of work to do. As the age-appropriate design code was coming into force here in the UK, we were very busy monitoring the policies and practices of some of the major tech platforms to try and understand whether this particular policy was going to have an impact both in the UK, but also what we were hoping for was an impact that it would proliferate out to kind of global children, not just to children based in the UK. One thing that we're really pleased to see, and again, very much not saying that all the work is done, but we were pleased to see that many platforms, in fact, made many changes in the few months preceding and just after the coming into force of the age-appropriate design code. And many of these changes reflect some of the interesting design choices that platforms can make, which can actually make their platforms much more age-appropriate for children. So I think if I was to give a summary, it's that with the policies in place, we have made progress. I think we are in a better place now, children surfing the net and using digital services than we were 4 years ago with the policy that we have, but certainly still a lot remains to do, and certainly some of the more complex requirements of the age-appropriate design code and also GDPR, those that rub up directly against the key monetization metrics of businesses, those are the ones I think that we still have to address, but undoubtedly massive progress has been made.
Those are the ones that we keep on seeing in the news popping up where they're not being addressed enough. Just briefly, could we go into the age-appropriate design code for some of our viewers who don't have a familiarity with this term?
Absolutely. So yes, I'll try and do it very, very quickly. The age-appropriate design code sets by 15 standards that digital service providers need to meet when they are within the scope of the legislation. Now, the two, I think, most important things that it did from a child perspective, especially in relation to, say, how we think about whether a service is under scope of COPPA or some of the other regulations, is that it changed who had to abide by the age-appropriate design code from what we're used to in COPPA, which is where services are directed at children and the services need to know that they have children on there, to what's called likely to be accessed. Okay. And this is because we believe that children should be protected where they are and not where we think they are or where they should be. And we think that's a really, really important part of the legislation. Indeed, this is something that is proliferating out in some of the other children's codes that are proliferating both in California, but also other European countries and around the world. The other thing which it did, which in many circumstances wouldn't be controversial, but in the world of data it is that it defined a child as any person under the age of 18. Now, COPPA set that bar at 13 all those years ago for reasons that remain slightly opaque. They were brought into the regulations here in Europe in GDPR, which allowed countries to choose between 13 and 16. As I say, we believe that children have a right to protection under 18. Now, what's important to say is that we don't believe that protections for a 5-year-old need to be the same as those for a 17-year-old. And this is why it's an age-appropriate design code and not a, make the internet safe for a 3-year-old code. That is not the purpose of the code. And then some of the things the code requires, for instance, things like turning off profiling by default, that the service engage in data minimization, that the service not share data about the child unless it is in the best interest of the child, that they provide transparency, easy tools. So there are 15 kind of standards like that companies must abide by. Now, one interesting thing is that there is no private right of action. So I can't take as an individual, take a service to court for breaching a standard. But once a standard of the GDPR or the Data Protection Act is broken, courts and the regulator will use the age-appropriate design code when thinking about what the remedies should be and what kind of ruling they should make. So that's one of the quite detailed points of the age-appropriate design code. For those wanting more, we've got lots of material on our website, Five Rights Foundation, and please do get in touch if you'd like any more information. We're always happy to share, and we always want to kind of spread the learning on this.
Thank you very much, Duncan. There's a lot of interesting information, especially towards the legislation that you guys have been doing in California right now. And another question that I have is about the BAK+. So can we explain to our viewers the latest development of European strategy for a better internet for kids, and also tying into the age-appropriate design code? I don't know if Anna, you'd like to talk something about this. Nicholas, Duncan, you again.
Sure, happy to come in this one, Jessica, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this really important discussion. I mean, I suppose the Better Internet for Kids is kind of a European level strategy that is based essentially on international principles around children's rights, so primarily the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it essentially kind of takes some of those really core principles and applies those to the digital environment. So recently what we have been seeing with the raft of new legislation coming out of the EU that's all addressed to the digital environment and to kind of promotion of higher standards and better protections for consumer. There is a very distinct focus on children's rights in the middle of that kind of policy focus. So with the Better Internet for Kids, it's really about participation and empowerment and protection online. So that this strategy is really going to influence the way that EU policymakers move forward. And as I said, we're already seeing it in legislation like the Digital Services Act, which, for example, is set to ban targeted advertising that's directed towards children. We're seeing it in the very recent proposal for the measures to combat child sexual abuse material online, which was published within the last month. You're seeing glimpses of it in the forthcoming artificial intelligence regulation, which specifically talks about the prohibition of technologies that will deploy subliminal measures and will potentially exploit the more vulnerable sections of society, in particular children, and it refers to users of the internet by reference to their age. So I think this is all kind of indicative of a kind of an EU strategy that's very much focused on safety and promotion of safe experiences online for users, and particularly paying attention to the rights of children. And as I said, there's a very strong influence coming from international law and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, you know, is all about, on the one hand, empowerment of children and their entitlement to, say, access information and impart ideas, and the right to be heard. And at the same time, the protective elements of that convention, which focus in on things like the best interests of the child, which is one of the cornerstones, in fact, of international child law. And you see that permeating through not only European policy and legislation. We're also seeing that in, for example, the age-appropriate design code that Duncan has talked about that's come out of the UK. You're seeing that best interest principle being talked about by the Irish regulator and its equivalent of the age-appropriate design code, which is called the Fundamentals for a Child-Oriented Approach to Data Processing. So I think all of these kind of international principles, which have been around for a very long time since the UN Convention came in 1989, are really beginning to kind of bubble up to the surface and be implemented in a very kind of practical and identifiable way in new EU legislative measures.
Thank you, Anna. And since these laws are coming from EU law and from the UN Convention, are we seeing that they're being implemented strongly enough? Or are we actually seeing change? And are we actually seeing companies adopt these legislative measures into their daily practices? Or where can we see some of the largest, perhaps, weaknesses in the fundamentals or in the design code?
I'm sure Duncan will want to speak to this issue as well, because obviously his organisation is very focused on surveying the current practices of platforms and digital services. I suppose one thing to say is some of those measures that I've talked about are not implemented yet. They'll be coming down the line. So the legislation is either making its way through the EU institutions, or it has just been agreed, like the Digital Services Act, or it's just been proposed, like the child sexual abuse material regulation that's targeted at combating that sort of material. In terms of, I suppose, when you look at a kind of pure privacy and data protection related approach to these things, you need to focus in, I suppose, on what regulators are looking at. And for example, with the Irish regulator, there are a number of large-scale investigations that are underway at the moment in relation to a number of different platforms around their use of children's data and measures aimed at children in relation to those platforms. And then equally, when you look at the European level grouping of data protection authorities, you can see that certainly providing practical advice on children's issues is top of the agenda, and the EDPB is currently working on guidance. You can see that in the work agenda for the grouping around children's issues. So I think we're probably just at the tipping point in terms of the kind of more active implementation of all of these policy choices that have been made and that have been harnessed in recent legislative decisions.
Thank you, Anna. And also sitting in Ireland, obviously where there's the most tech hubs, do you see that these large tech giants are going in the right direction, that they're actually making a lot of the differences that legislators are putting out there?
I mean, I think that there's a real desire amongst tech companies to try, to try to do the right thing. I think it's challenging for them in some ways, particularly where platforms have been designed in a particular way, and features and settings and user mechanisms and kind of the core aspects of the service may have been built in for a very long time. And I think that's where kind of data protection by design and default comes into play, and the obligations that organizations, data controllers have under the GDPR to implement measures that will secure a higher level of protection for children, because the GDPR in particular recognizes that children are more vulnerable to risks around the processing of their personal data, and particularly in the digital environment. So I think with the guidelines that we're seeing coming out of different regulators, be it the fundamentals or the age appropriate design code, and those kind of practical tools and the practical direction towards how to ensure compliance. I mean, it's a matter of platforms really having to focus in on their own services and to look at aspects of their services that are possibly the riskiest to children. So, for example, age verification and age assurance is a really, really big issue. And certainly in Ireland with the fundamentals.
It's difficult to implement age verification, right? For companies that I've spoken with as well.
Well, particularly because I think age verification and age assurance, these are terms that are kind of bandied about, but certainly in the GDPR, there isn't any definition of what they actually mean. So they're kind of a term of art to a certain extent. And different regulators have tried to define those in their own terms. But really, when you look at age verification or age assurance, whatever way you want to describe it, there's such a range of measures available in the spectrum, from the least measures that might achieve the least certainty, for example, self-declarations and age gating, right up to the other end of the spectrum, which might involve measures around checking, for example, government issued ID, to check the identity and the age of that person. So obviously there are privacy issues that really come into play when you're looking at age verification as well. And this is where we're seeing regulators say that age verification or age assurance measures really should be proportionate to the risk that is posed, particularly in a digital environment, by an online service or platform. And essentially privacy still has to be respected, and so it's a matter. It is difficult for organizations that are toying with all of these sorts of issues and trying to get the balance right. But certainly, I think there's lots of guidance out there, and really for these sorts of organizations that are grappling with the regime, I think it's really important that they have the right people around the table, whether that's the engineers, the coders, the UX designers, the privacy lawyers, and importantly, I think the children's rights experts as well, because that's certainly something that you're seeing in guidance, certainly in the fundamentals, emphasizing the importance of having experts in the room who understand the children's rights regime, particularly under the UN Convention, but also understanding children's developmental stages, how they tend to move around the internet, because what I've heard from experts is they move around services and features of any given service in a completely different way to the way in which adults would navigate that service. So, you know, those sorts of insights and expertise are really important when you're designing a platform, or in fact, redesigning it to take into account all of these sorts of safeguards that we're seeing regulators say should be part and parcel now of a child-friendly approach to technology and online services.
Exactly. That's very interesting what you say, Anna. It's not just a legislator, a policy expert that it's going to have to be in charge. We're going to have to bring different people, you know, child psychologists as well, and engineers and everything, so that we can actually fix the tools out there and make them more child friendly. On this question, I also would like to start into the whole product side of technology. That's also something that's very interesting for our viewers. So I don't know if you or Nicholas or Duncan, could you elaborate on the terms, for example, safety by design, how that differs also from privacy by design, and the responsible use of children's data and age-appropriate content when it comes to the available technology out there?
I'm happy to jump on this one, although I would be curious to hear Duncan's thoughts and Anna's as well. Thanks a lot for having me, Jessica. Appreciate the invite. Safety by design, I think it's an interesting question to compare that and contrast it with privacy by design. In some ways, I think this goes to some points that Duncan's raised earlier with respect to the ICO code, which is that when companies are conducting, for example, privacy impact assessments, which is a requirement for certain types of data processing under the GDPR, and the UK code and the Irish fundamentals both make clear that this is where children are involved and where the processing is going to involve children's data, you need to be conducting a DPIA. And more typically, when companies go through that exercise, what they're going to do is they're going to consider the privacy risks. That's the chief risk when you're assessing the processing of personal data. You look at the privacy risk. Is someone's data going to be vulnerable if the data would be breached and exposed to other parties? Would someone be surprised that their data might be used for a purpose that is not fully disclosed in the privacy notice or is used in other ways? But when we get into this realm of children's data, I think what's interesting is that the risk analysis, especially as articulated in the ICO children's code and the Irish fundamentals, it broadens quite a bit, because it says, look, we're not just looking here at privacy risk, we're looking at a variety of potential risks to children. And the ICO sets out this information in quite a bit of detail in some of the materials they've released in the wake of children's code coming out. For example, there's a standard 5 in that code that refers to detrimental use of a child's data. And again, this is not just regarding potential breaches of privacy, but talks about things like a loss of time, that platforms are designed in a way right now that ask children and seek their continuous engagement and connection online to these games, instead of, for example, building in pauses or reminders to take a break and go outside and get some exercise, or perhaps other types of elements that might be in their well-being, which again, it's not necessarily a privacy risk, but is in the best interest of the child, which is a heavy and high standard to keep in mind. Relatedly, things relating to, for example, children being presented age inappropriate content or products that are not appropriate to their age group. Even things like, I think Anna had alluded to, the child sexual abuse material concerns, and the idea of children being groomed in certain ways online that are just inappropriate and of course dangerous to children. And so this is, I think, what we talk about when we're talking about safety by design. Is it's not just a concern purely around processing personal data, but it takes into account some of these broader risks. And that really goes as well to your question about the responsible use of children's data. So maybe something also alluding back to what Duncan mentioned earlier was the sort of contrast between maybe the COPPA standard you've seen in the US in place for some time, is that standard has really focused on the parental role and the parental guardian role of sort of overseeing children's activities online and playing a role of sort of a gatekeeper to prevent unnecessary harms or inappropriate things from being accessed by that child. But over time, as technology is involved, as these platforms have evolved, as social media has arisen, you've seen, I think, probably in some ways, parents having a difficulty keeping a pace with these new technologies and ways that their children are accessing information. And so the code and the Irish fundamentals really say, look, we're not just going to place this burden entirely on the parents. We're really going to ask platforms and companies to take a responsibility in and of themselves and So in that sense, it's not just about obtaining parental consent and giving notice to parents, but it's saying, look, children have an independent right to be provided information about how their data is used, to be ensured that their things that they're able to access and use online are appropriate to them and not exposing them to inappropriate dangers. And you know, these time, I think Anna gave a great sort of overview of these different areas in which we're seeing this come in place in Europe in terms of the DSA that's coming out, the recently released proposed regulation on child sexual abuse material, which is following from a sort of stopgap measure that was put in place for that topic, and then now they're looking to formalize more generally this policy initiative. And even recently, you had a statement issued by the European competition authorities together with the privacy authorities with respect to advertising to children. And that said, essentially, you shouldn't be targeting certain types of advertising to children. You should be taking into account their vulnerabilities and their particular credulity when you're issuing advertising to them. So really, from all directions in Europe and the UK, other parts of, you're seeing these things come out, and the regulators and the lawmakers sort of put into play every tool at their disposal to say, we're going to protect children, we're going to put their interests first, and we're going to hold companies and organizations to account if they're not promoting and abiding by those rules and standards.
Thank you, Nicholas. And exactly what you're saying, something that I find very important by safety by design, is that the burden should not only be placed on the parent, because a lot of times the parent doesn't have the capability and the resources for the burden to fall on him or herself. And that's why regulators and also companies need to look at more of a comprehensive approach towards having a safer digital world. Following on this question, I don't know if Anna and Duncan, you'd also like to say something, but I'm also interested in the digital well-being of children. So my next question is, how can digital well-being be further supported, and what more needs to be done to address possible mental health issues and issues with teenagers linked to the use of, let's say, social media? We've seen a lot about social media and cyberbullying and harassment, and also with more futuristic technology such as the metaverse, we see these kind of issues that are going to start to pop up more and more. So how can we further support this?
I mean, there's no doubt that, you know, there's definitely going to be challenges ahead, and absolutely the metaverse presents its own series of challenges that, you know, we're just starting to try and get our head around. But I think the bulk of what we're talking about, if you want to get a better experience for children online, are the two kind of main criteria that you talked about before. It's integrating safety into the design process, so we are not trying to fix things that were built. And we've got to remember that the kind of designers who are building our applications are and our digital services, you know, they are being told to maximize time, maximize users, and each of those users to maximize activity on there. And that can be through consuming, connecting, interacting, sharing. And so that's kind of their model, because ultimately that's what increases users, and users, you know, in many of the digital markets, users plus, you know, by time equals revenue, because ultimately it's all a, you know, kind of an ad-based revenue model. So while we are continuing to design services that broadly fit into that category, and then trying to, you know, fix them afterwards with a few band-aids, you know, that is always going to be the challenge. But that's not to say it's impossible. And so we've seen many services designed with that incentive actually start to make safety by design choices. So we saw many of the large platforms, for instance, turn off the ability for unknown and unconnected adults to either direct message, friend request, connect with children. Now that should be, you know, a relatively no-brainer, that was both a relatively serious risk, but ultimately what it does is it drives that connectivity, it drives users, it drives activity. And so it is something that was traditionally, you know, kept on. So we're seeing platforms move to that. So that is a way that is already making these platforms and digital services better for children, safer for children, and is very easy to do. So, you know, some of the challenges we're facing are complex, and obviously Anna brought up the age assurance challenge, which is definitely complex. I don't think insurmountable, but definitely complex. But some of them are really simple policy changes. You know, another one, and we've talked about it already a few times, is obviously that many of the digital services rely on personalized ads for their revenue model. Now, the EU has just passed through the DSA a prohibition on personalized ads for children. And what's interesting is that already many of the platforms are kind of getting ahead of that. So YouTube, for instance, has already made all adverts to children contextual on their platform. So again, this is a way that, again, the internet can be just made that little bit safer. And it's by making hundreds of incremental steps. There are no silver bullets that get us to that perfectly safe internet. Indeed, we can never get to the perfectly safe internet, because we can only get to a place that is better, safer by design, and so on. And similarly, around the responsible use of children's data, for the moment, there is a perception, partly justified, that children's data is, and users' data in general, but children's data specifically, is being used almost adversarially by the platforms against the child to keep the child there for longer, provide ads, monetize the child's experience. Such a different concept when you're thinking about, what about if I use that data, that what I know about the child, to improve their experience? So, and that's a completely different way of thinking about it. But that's also one of the things that we, want to shift, is that there can actually be, there can be some good uses of data, especially when that is to provide more transparency, education, better default settings, things like that. So we can use the little bit of data that we have about children to actually improve their experience, rather than use it kind of adversarially against them. So it's just, some of the things.
And also through that, have a better standing also in the marketplace in terms of all of these platforms dedicated to children. I don't know if Duncan or Anna, you'd like to add anything, if not, move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Duncan raises a lot of kind of interesting points and really salient points around, this issue of the internet, and the internet being a place that should be kind of rewarding and attractive for children, but also safe, so that they can kind of fully exercise all of those international law rights, that I talked about earlier, the right to kind of impart and seek and receive information and exchange ideas, and so that, essentially the internet and digital services provide a kind of a safe space for children to be able to grow and, learn and play and interact. And I suppose those sorts of themes, I think, are, kind of at a regulatory level, at the privacy level, you are seeing them already kind of baked into, the guidance that has come out. And Duncan talked about, children, their settings, public settings, now no longer allowing, third parties to contact children. And equally, you're seeing regulators recommending, that the use of nudge techniques not be deployed with children. So children should be encouraged not only not to kind of unknowingly or unintentionally share personal data, like setting their accounts to private, but also that they should be encouraged to be kind of curious and cautious about their own safety and their own experience and their own data online. And you can do this to children through kind of, I suppose, intuitive design features that allow children to kind of seek more transparency information in particular, which is a really kind of key issue, and the way in which you go about kind of delivering that to children and helping them to learn more about particular settings. So the whole empowerment theme, I think, is an important one, and obviously that comes from international law as well. The children should understand why a platform is designed in a particular way, why there are safety features that are there, so why settings might be automatically set to default, by default to off, like geolocation being set to off, so that kids don't think that they're being deprived of a kind of a richer or more adult based user experience, that they understand that these sorts of techniques and mechanisms are actually there for their own best interest. So it's kind of emphasizing that there is no kind of denigration of service for kids to kids, so that they want to kind of operate in that kind of safer space that kind of helps them to kind of explore, in a way that poses less risks to them overall. So I think, the whole idea about not locking out children, not blocking them from that rich user experience is a really, really important one. And what that means, I think, in kind of practical design terms, and compliance terms for organizations is, is ensuring that they're actually embedding all of these interpretive principles and rules that we're seeing regulators set out, embedding those into their services and creating that kind of safer environment for under 18s. And again, it all goes back, I think, to age verification and age assurance, because, to kind of create and direct children towards that safer experience, you have to be able to recognize children amongst your user base as well. So there is certainly something of a circularity to some of these issues.
Thank you, Anna. That's very interesting. And when we're talking about children, just children being in the focal point, where do you think that the burden lies? Should it lie on the parents to be able to explain to the children, okay, this is how this tool works, these are the things that you should pay attention to, or should it lie on the manufacturers of the tool to embed that then into their design code and into the technology itself, and have then different measures to communicate that to children? Because at the end of the day, I think that there's also a large discrepancy as to who is actually responsible to translate that into something that children can understand.
I mean, I think ultimately, if you go back to first principles, certainly in terms of privacy law and the GDPR, if organizations, data controllers are collecting data, are utilizing certain tools, certain mechanisms in their services, but then really the responsibility that data protection by design and default obligation is falling to them, and making sure that their own designers and user experience people and coders, etc., are all kind of aware of the right way to design. It's an interesting point that you raise about parents, because I think when you read kind of research and surveys of parents, a lot of them will express the view that they feel somewhat, not necessarily disenfranchised, but they certainly feel at an information imbalance in terms of their kids being far more I suppose fluent and kind of knowledgeable about use of digital services than they might feel, and I think that's where it comes back to these sorts of data protection by design and default principles and tools, for example, that are set out in Chapter 7 of the Fundamentals, which reinforce the idea that default settings, which are in the kind of directed towards a better, more safer experience for children, they should be switched on kind of almost at factory setting. So it comes down to organizations that are kind of making their services available to ensuring that they need to ensure that these default settings are on, because it can be difficult for parents to understand the kind of the games and the technologies and the social media services that their kids are using, and then not only to be able to get to grips with that whole kind of intricate ecosystem that their kid might be immersed in, but also then to be able to find the settings and the buttons and know how to control privacy settings and go and switch it off. So I think, to put that burden on parents, it's a huge one. And ultimately, I think, at least when you look at it through the lens of data protection and GDPR, certainly I think that burden is there on data controllers and organizations that are making the services available.
I agree. Thank you very much. And we were just talking right now about age verification, the age-old age verification term. I'd like to discuss what are the limitations of existing age verification process of users online. For example, do these codes of conduct and standards on age assurance and age-appropriate design exist? And how can risk assessment and mitigation measures be further encouraged? Nicholas, I don't know if you'd like to tackle that one, or Duncan, or both. And we have insights from both sides.
Sure, happy to say a few words. I mean, certainly the ICO last summer, as they are approaching the end of the one-year grace period for the entry into effect of the Children's Code, did go about basically conducting an analysis with some age verification scheme providers, and have approved two age verification schemes. Two sort of age assurance and age child's online privacy verification schemes. So essentially, this is a voluntary code or standard that you can agree to. I think, as I understand it, you'd have to agree to apply certain technical principles and specifications to your site. And you would basically get a certification stamp at the conclusion of that would enable a company. It doesn't, essentially give you a free pass past the ICO or other European regulators that might question some of your practices with respect to children, but it's a good documented, clear-cut way to say, we've taken this into account, we've put in place measures to comply with these standards and requirements. And specifically, we looked at this issue of age verification and have sought to ensure that what we are asking people to provide in terms of the data is appropriate, proportionate, and is actually effective in terms of identifying more or less what age the user is and whether they're able to access a platform or service that is appropriate to their age group. And this also comes in on the topic of consent, which is where under GDPR, if consent is the legal basis you're needing to rely on to process the child's data, and it is a child under the age of consent as defined at 13 in the UK or in other ages across Europe, then you would need to have a way of reaching out to the parent and seeking parental consent for that purpose. So it's really a multifaceted topic when you talk about this issue of age verification, and it presents some challenges, I think, for companies in terms of deciding what is appropriate for the risk. Are there contents and services just essentially games that children can access and that should not generally be objectionable? They may collect limited data. Would a neutral age gate that just asks someone to enter their year of birth, would that be appropriate to rely upon? Or does something else need to happen? And this came up last year, or with respect to an online social media platform where a child was able to access the platform, and unfortunately, due to peer pressure and some of the activities she got involved in, ended up basically killing herself. So there are these dangers out there, and the regulator in that case concluded, look, you can't just sort of take their word for it necessarily. You need to introduce additional measures. That might also include things like even AI and the use of AI to, behind the scenes, do certain analysis to see what the child's age is likely to be, because look, it is possible that children will try to get onto platforms that are not specifically targeted or appropriate for them. That is part of the nature, I suppose, of being a child and as a parent trying to ensure that. But again, these are not always easy things to manage. So it's a real challenge, and it involves some serious thinking, like Anna said, with your user experience people, with your design people, with your product folks, to say, how can we look at this carefully for each different service potentially, to see what is the measures we're going to ask people to provide, or we're going to just simply use potentially in the background, respecting privacy at the same time, of course, to ensure that users are of an appropriate age.
Thank you, Nicholas. Duncan, would you like to add something as well, since you have a lot of expertise from the UK side?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I mean, age assurance is a big area for Five Rights. It's an area that we work on a lot. And I think for me, having spent kind of the last 6 months kind of getting into the arguments, what we have here is, from a technical perspective, a relatively simple thing that we need to do, given the amazing things that the digital technology can do for us. Actually figuring out the age of users is something that is actually relatively simple. The other thing to say is that all the big platforms already know the age of their users because of the pervasive tracking on these platforms, and are already estimating the age of the users. So we also just need to think through that this is already happening in a way, but just not in a transparent way, that we can both understand how they're using it and then actually forcing them to do something good with it. The other thing to think about is that understanding the age of your user is definitely not the same as having to know the identity of your user. Now, sometimes these processes can happen at the same time, but many services purely look at the age and don't go anywhere towards identifying the identity. So just because some platforms might need to find the age is not the same as everybody having to identify themselves. Then I would say that in the last months, I've spoken to, 20, 30 different providers. There's a real range of companies out there. But what I can definitely say is that there are many that operate on a high privacy model where I would be happy to use their services, knowing that the absolute minimum of data was being processed. Indeed, some of them even do all the processing on your own device, so that literally nothing leaves your device other than a hashed answer to the age question. The problem, as I see it, and why Five Rights advocates for mandatory standards in this area, is that the history of tech is that we should not trust them with our data. And most of the big platforms have at some stage come across a story where they have either collected data they shouldn't, used it in a way that they shouldn't, or so on. And so rightly, there's a fear that, especially at some of the sensitive corners, that age assurance is going to have to be used at. So you can think about pornography websites and things like that. That this idea that there's some kind of entry gate coupled with then quite sensitive data about a person's viewing habits of adult material rightly causes people to have concerns. And that's why we think only once mandatory minimum standards are in place, that not just say, oh, you should minimize the data and then delete it, but that mandates it and that says you can only get this certification if you do it. That is what we think needs to get us over to the next stage of this development. Now,
so you're thinking of certification, sorry to interrupt, but a certification, then something, I mean, we don't have that for GDPR, obviously, but so something more in terms of children's privacy is what is needed for these tech giants and different platforms out there?
Well, what's interesting is that the tech giants for the moment are staying away from delivering this service themselves, and they're absolutely relying on third parties to do it for them. And what's really interesting here is that the age assurance providers, the good ones, the ones that we want, are demanding standards. Civil society is demanding standards, and the platforms are demanding standards. And yet we still have a dearth of standards around age assurance kind of globally. So this is an area where everybody wants the standards. We need the standards in order to get to the next stage. The other really important thing to remember is that, you know, finding out the age is not the end in and of itself. It is only useful if you then do something with it. It is only there to give something to the child, a better experience, better information, and in certain circumstances, restrict their access to it. You know, 5-year-olds should not be able to access hardcore pornography without any kind of barrier to that access. That is not right. But equally, a 17-year-old should not have to show his passport to watch a Peppa Pig video on YouTube. We need to get sensible about where the restrictions are and what we need to do, and ultimately that the different challenges are different. One interesting example around the implementation of age assurance, which we are seeing now more and more, you know, Instagram announced just a few days ago, so was for Roblox. So Roblox is a really popular game with a majority of users below 13. So it's catering for a young audience in terms of data and protection, the ones that require the most protection. And they've recently implemented into the system a kind of voice chat functionality so that gamers within the game can chat to each other using their real voices within real rooms. So a slight kind of one step into the metaverse kind of thing. Now, what's interesting is that Roblox, which seeks to be a place that is suitable for everybody, for all ages, has in its implementation of a risky design feature, which voice chat, room voice chat is widely recognized as, didn't then decide to age gate the whole of Roblox, but instead it still allows everybody onto Roblox. But if a user wants to utilize this additional functionality, they then need to prove that they are of a certain age, or in the US, get parental, authority, get parental verification. So I think that's much more how we're going to see the future of kind of service design as well, is that services are not going to want to create any friction between the users and access to as much of their service as possible. And so what we'll in fact see is kind of ring fence the safe service, which everybody will be allowed to go in. And then as users get comfortable with platforms and services and then want to access more, they will then access these additional services, some of which will require some form of age assurance. The interesting thing about that is that because the users will then have actually spent some time on the platform, even things like self-declaration crossed with the kind of some of the behavioral insights generated from the platform should be able to, give quite a lot. So again, if the risk is not so high, there are even places where there is a place for self-declaration, provided it's checked up and things like that, So it's really important. It's technically possible to do, but for us, it's really standards that get in the way of this being widely adopted because of the wide mistrust of data use in the digital economy.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. And that's actually something that I was going to go to on my next question. How can we ensure that these standards get adopted? For example, how can it be ensured that the data minimization principle is respected when it comes to the use of children's data? Also, the age verification process, how can we make sure as as companies that this actually is ensured. Anna's.
Yeah, I might just might pick up on the whole issue and the need for the standardization in age verification and age assurance, because it's interesting. You started off today's webinar by talking about the Better Internet for Kids and that EU level strategy, and of course one of the kind of high points of the European Union's kind of vision, I suppose, to make the internet a safer place for kids in particular, is to work towards standardization in age verification and age assurance. Now, what that's going to look like and when that's going to come, remains to be seen. But it's interesting to see that it's up there as one of the big ticket items. And I think it's also worth pointing out that there has been another project that's been underway at an EU level. It's an EU funded project called the EU Consent Project. Now, it's not so much looking at different technologies and the efficacy of different technologies for age verification and age assurance, but it's more looking at whether it's possible to design a kind of an interoperable network between age verification providers and even companies that are engaging in age verification themselves, so that there can be kind of a method of sharing. So once a certain threshold has been reached as regards the age of a user, that information can kind of be passed across through a network, and work is ongoing in that project. It was an EU funded project, and there's a consortium of providers across Europe that are looking at that. So I think that's a really interesting project for listeners to follow if they're interested in it. But I mean, I suppose all of this points to this topic, this need for standardization being high on the list, high on the agenda of EU lawmakers anyway. And I think, given that it is, the internet has no borders, it's really important that these sorts of initiatives are actually happening at a much broader, kind of higher level EU perspective, so that that when these solutions are ultimately set out and when standards are kind of established, that they do have a kind of a general application, so that it does make it much easier for businesses, particularly across Europe, to be able to implement it and have a kind of a standardized approach to this quite tricky issue.
I think that's what we see with the GDPR, how it's so nice and so nicely regulated, and as well as being used by companies, is that there is this level of standardization. And that's also something that we see in the US that's quite difficult, is that it's so fragmented, the whole policy structure, that it doesn't work as well as we see it working in Europe. So I definitely understand the need for standardization. Nicholas, I don't know if you'd like to add something else. If not, I'd head over to my last questions.
No, just on that point, I think it's interesting that certainly what's happening in Europe is inspiring things to develop across the world. Duncan alluded earlier to the California.
That's where I was going to be headed, Nicholas.
Okay, well then I don't want to anticipate your question.
Perfect,
Please go ahead.
perfect. No, let's go. Perfect.
Well, no, you have now had adopted a essentially children's code, very much inspired by the UK age-appropriate design code in California. Which California has been, I'd say, the state in the US that has sort of been at the forefront of introducing more stringent privacy laws, and perhaps due in part to the fact that you have Silicon Valley, where you have a number of large tech companies based, that this would be natural that it might come out of California if you still have this model in the US of this state-based and sort of loosely regulated at the federal level, sector by sector approach. So certainly some states are taking it upon themselves to say, look, we're going to do something in addition here. And this, unfortunately, on the one hand, it's positive, I think, in the sense that you see an evolution of the rules. You see states maybe having an easier and more efficient way, although others would push back at that. But they do have, in general, and it's easier to pass state-based legislation than federal legislation in the US for sure. And other states then get inspired by that. So now you have laws not only in California, but also in places like Colorado, Virginia, Connecticut, Utah, where you're seeing additional protections coming into place. And also on that basis, potentially that would also serve a net benefit for children. So it is interesting how these things are evolving. There's, again, also currently on the federal legislative agenda, the potential for a federal level privacy bill to be introduced in the US. This has happened before, and maybe this isn't the last time that something like this is proposed and doesn't ultimately make its way through the the legislative process and is signed by the president. But you see an ongoing awareness, I think, among lawmakers and among industry to want to have a standard set of rules and not to have to go down to a state-by-state analysis across 50 states of which particular user population am I dealing with here, which particular rules do I have to apply. I'd like to apply sort of a standard set across the board. That's why I think you've seen a number of large tech companies advocating for a federal set of rules in the US on topics like this. Obviously, COPA is a federal level law, and there has also been talk of reforming COPA in terms of, for example, removing the actual knowledge test and introducing something more like the likely to be access test. So that is a possibility. You also see the FTC recently, and I know we'd started this talk on the issue of EdTech, so kind of coming full circle. There was a statement issued last month in respect to educational technology, where the FTC reminded EdTech providers that there is these COPA rules out there. By the way, it's not just about providing notice and consent to parents, but they also reminded providers in the EdTech space around topics like data minimization, not collecting more than is needed, or using data for pupils who are accessing classes online to use that data for any sort of monetization purpose or for future speculative reasons. There needs to be certain technical and organizational security controls in place. Data retention needs to be in place. So there is, that I think that ongoing tension in the U.S. of the sort of state-based model that you're seeing, some federal level regulation that's evolving, but is taking time to evolve. And whether or not ultimately you're going to see a sort of omnibus federal level set of rules for privacy is going to be something to watch for. I think momentum is growing continuously, and that it's more likely today than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And it's just perhaps a matter of time until we see the ball moving further on that.
Thank you, Nicholas. That's all very interesting insights. And exactly that's why I found this talk very interesting today and why I wanted to put it together, especially looking at how we have entire populations of children and from different age groups completely shifting online. And we see online use being much more prevalent in younger children. And that's why it's becoming much more of a hot and very relevant topic. So it's important to see all the different factors that go into having a safer digital world for children in essence. So it looks like time is running out, and I wanted to thank you, Anna, Duncan, and Nicholas so much for your insights today and for coming on Tech That Talks. And I hope that our viewers enjoyed listening and have learned a lot, and will take all of this information hopefully when they design their next platforms. If anyone is interested in learning more about 5 Rights, please email me at jessica.benny@usercentrics.com or check out 5 Rights, and you can connect with Duncan. And so, as always, thank you so much for joining, everyone, and I hope to see you on our next Tech That Talks. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, Jessica.
Bye.